Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 19th of September, and in today's update we're looking at the past 48 hours of advances, including the Russian capture of Novoivanivka and additional advances along the border between Zaporizhzhia and Dnipro Oblasts. We'll look at the third wave of Russian infiltrations into the city of Pokrovsk, but this time from a different angle. Furthermore, there are advances to the east of Kostyantynivka within the Zaporizhzhia forest, in the town of Chandrikholove to the northwest of Lyman, and we'll give you guys an update on the Kharkiv front and the battle for Kupyansk, and then a quick word on Sumy to finish off the video. So as we get into it, I want to thank my new members, David X. Brown and Ralph Duff. I greatly appreciate the support. It means a lot to me. And so as we get into it, please like, share, subscribe, anything you guys want. But let's get into it over here. You can see that the Russian side has been able to capture what remains of Novoivanivka. They were able to set foot over here around September 15th, and then by the 16th, a video from the Shadow drone unit showed that they conducted FPV strikes and grenade drops onto the Russian soldiers that were storming the town. Now, given the fact that the surface area in this village is so small, it was simply unfeasible for the Ukrainians to organize a counterattack in time. It was also impossible due to how disconnected Novoivanivka is from the nearby Ukrainian nodes of defense. So for instance, it's about 4 kilometers away from Novovasilivske, and then in between you just have these large open fields. Now there are also trenches, so we'll open up the trench map to give you guys an idea of the Ukrainian defenses that have been taken over by the Russians in the process. And then to the northwest, you have this other village that is also disconnected from the Yanchor River line, that being Novohrihorivka, about 3 kilometers away from Novoivanivka. So the Ukrainians, given the fact that they have eventually come to realize that the situation over here is untenable and that the Ukrainians now only have the open fields and some fortifications meant to absorb attacks from the south, not from the east, those are the only layers of defense left before the Russians actually arrive at the contact point of the Yanchor River and begin threatening a mainstay of Ukrainian defense for the past 3 years over here, areas that had never been touched before. So we can see that in terms of the advances over the past 2 days, they captured about half a square kilometer within Novoivanivka, and then were able to take an additional 1.5 square kilometers slightly to the south. And so you can see how this salient is beginning to form with the Russians pushing along this particular paved road and then extending their push southwards, taking over a lot of ravines, tree lines, and it will make a lot more sense once I open the trenches for you guys, which is one of the reasons why I love the trench map. It gives you guys an idea of why the Russians are pushing in particular areas. So this really rapid Russian push in relative terms has been able to nullify any potential Ukrainian advantage that they could have gotten from holding out in these fortified posts. Now they've been taken over in quick succession, and the routes into the Yanchor River line and the villages perhaps on the eastern bank like Pavlivka and some parts of Novovasilivske are rather open. You have the road that is open, and you just have this thinner layer of the trench line. This, in this case, is the first line of defense protecting Zaporizhzhia that is left. And you could see how the goal, yet again, is to absorb attacks coming in from the south, not to have the Russians running along the northeastern flank of the trenches, storming them, and then using those same trenches as a route to then hook southwards and take over other portions of the trench line that are located a bit to the south. So that's an issue when it comes to Ukraine's anticipation. Another issue is the fact that their defense over here simply was disconnected from the main logistics hubs, the main command and control centers. They did not send in reinforcements at a fast enough pace. Yes, they did send in the 3rd and 1st battalions of the 154th Mechanized Brigade, as I reported. I think I was the first to do so across basically all of social media. I just saw it on Ukrainian forums where they were talking about people missing in action, and they referenced this particular unit. And that has been the case since about late August. That's when this unit was moved over here, at least in part. And that was about it when it comes to reinforcing the sector. And so that's nowhere near enough for such a vast area where there's so much fluidity and it's so porous that it's easy for the Russians to push in areas that are unguarded, and doing so largely on foot at this point. So yes, we have to keep a keen eye out for the Yanchor River Valley and the consequences of this salient that is formed. You could see it over here with this rectangle. because now they're going to use Novoivanivka as a staging ground for deeper attacks. Furthermore, they took over the open fields in between the paved road that sort of branches out of Temerivka and the area to the south of Obratny. So another 3.25 square kilometers of territory captured. We have to keep in mind that the Russians could be looking at taking over Novohrivka with the intention of then setting posts up over here on these fields that directly overlook positions in Uspanivka and Pavlivka. And that would just completely undermine the entire river line upstream all the way downstream to Poltavka, for instance. At the same time, there are reports of a full Russian capture of Berezhove. I'm not sure if this is correct, but it's now being circulated widely, for instance, on Divgen. At a minimum, they've been able to capture additional chunks of the northeastern side of the town. But in regards to the full capture, so far, there's no proof to back it up, but something that is certainly possible given the fact that the Russians have established positions in Novomykolaiivka, in Chernove, and also have been able to infiltrate into the town from the north. And so it's already in the process of envelopment. So it would not be far-fetched to assert that the Russians have been able to take over the rest of it in rapid succession, meaning that a lot of villages, for instance, like Kalanivsk and Stepove, are now within the line of sight and can also be threatened. Yet again, a vast countryside that is to the south of the second line of defense in Zaporizhzhia is under threat due to an utter lack of defenses, both static defenses and reinforcements from the Ukrainian side. And the logistics situation is also, yet again, very poor. But let's move on rather quickly now and zoom in over here on the Russian capture of Muravka. I believe this was conducted by the 35th Motor Rifle Brigade. So they were able to storm from the south and also from Novomykolaiivka to the east and took over 3.5 square kilometers of territory. This video over here from September 19th shows how they captured it. They raised their flags, of course, and then they also stormed nearby dugouts that are largely based out of locations slightly to the west of Muravka. The fact that Muravka has been taken over means that all of the settlement lines to the south of the Solona River, which is something that you can see very clearly demarcated by the Dnipro-Donetsk border, that entire southern bank where you had populated areas and basements that the Ukrainians would resist in, they've all been cleared out by the Russians, meaning that they now have the opportunity to continue branching out in the southwestward direction. And you can see over here why that is important, because there is an opportunity to overrun some of Ukraine's defenses along the vertical portion of the Dnipro-Donetsk border, and then from there establish positions running along this particular paved road and running along the Solona River to arrive at the northeastern outskirts of Novopavlivka. So this is yet again a way for the Russians to expand their horizons, broaden the amount of attack vectors, and thereby split the Ukrainian defenses and keep them less unified. So that's a part of the rationale as well. Now in Pokrovsk, this is interesting. We have a video, and this is the second video over the course of 3 days, backing up the fact that the Russians may be now in their third wave of infiltrations into the city. You can see over here that on September 17th, the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade ambushed 2 Ukrainian soldiers in the Durniak microdistrict. So they were able to make this track from the Russian-controlled parts of Volontovichi. They crossed over past the cemetery, past the government buildings and open fields. So it appears as if they found a weak point in the Ukrainian defenses over here. They were able to cross over the T-046 and then from there infiltrate into these houses within this more rural or more suburban chunk of Pokrovsk on the western outskirts. And it's referred to as the Durniak microdistrict. At a certain point, they spotted 2 Ukrainian soldiers that were walking out in the open, and they ambushed them and killed them. And that provided evidence due to the fact that they were killed via small arms fire, that the Russians are certainly nearby. And the fact that the Ukrainians are walking out in the open does imply that the Russians probably were operating in small groups and likely were DRGs in this particular case. But it does show yet again that they are pushing the mantle forward. And this was not an area that DRGs really infiltrated over the past 2 waves. The Russian focus has been much more concentrated since, say, late July on the Market District, on Jubilee Park, on certain areas near the rail line and near the Shakhtarsky District. It's not necessarily been on the western edge, and it appears as if now they've been able to sense a gap in the Ukrainian commitment due to all of the previous engagements, and now they're trying to exploit that and potentially cause harm, try to physically assault, or cut off the E50 highway, or at the very least make it more difficult for the Ukrainians to move in. At this point in time, moving vehicles through the E50 highway is extremely dangerous. The Russians, their drone crews have an omnipresence in the skies, especially within Pokrovsk and in the over here in the western entrance. And same thing goes for the road between Pokrovsk and Mirnorod. It's extremely difficult for the Ukrainians to move in anything, let alone during daylight hours. And so the supply situation is extremely constrained by those facts on the ground. And this has been the case for a month now. The fact that Russian drone crews, and this is largely due to the contributions of the Rubicon Drone Center, their operators have been able to make it a living nightmare to get in and out of the city. And at the same time, though, the Ukrainians on the ground have been able to hold the line and prevent any sort of leakage of Russian forces deeper into the city. But now we're seeing yet again a trend of the Russians near Jubilee Park for the first time on the 17th, and now in Durniak. And this is actually for the first time on September 19th. So certainly keep an eye out for that, because it appears as if there may be a weak point over there. Now, let's turn off the trench map for a moment over here and look at what happened in Alexander Shultine. The Russians were able to capture 0.8 square kilometers of territory, and this is a video from September 19th, of grenade drops onto Russian infantry, and they were taking over windbreaks because you have the rail line over here, along with some nearby dugouts. And as a result, they were spotted and targeted in kind. But it does indicate that the Russians are now expanding the horizon south of the village, trying to take over these swaths of open fields. And in some cases, there are a lot of fortified posts over here. They're not necessarily manned, but they are still static defenses that have to be overrun. And that would be with the objective of finally taking over the network of villages running along the Kryvyi River all the way up into Kostyantynivka. So that would include Nelipivka, Plashivka, Ivanopolia, and other such small towns. And that's all parts of an effort to sort of coalesce the advances that were recently made southeast of Kostyantynivka into a single larger salient and larger vector that can be used to actually, dig a dagger into the city itself. Now, let's move on to the situation in the Severantsky Forest and along the northern bank of the Donets River. You can see over here that the Russian forces were able to capture 1.5 square kilometers of territory based on a geolocation of Russian flags being raised on the northern bank of the river. They showed the course of the fighting and the overrunning of some Ukrainian fortifications. So there were actual small arms clashes, close quarters engagements. The Russians, during the process, were able to capture a lot of the Ukrainian fortified posts, and you could see in the footage that was released by RIA Novosti that the foliage is not present along many parts of the forest, and that would be more so a phenomenon in the areas a bit to the northeast, so say south of Kuzminie or south of Dubrova, even south of Kremina. Those areas have far less foliage, and that's a consequence of the fact that those were the locations targeted most by both sides, because that's where the line of contact was for 3 years now. And we can see that over here. I'll turn on the fortifications for a moment. There were so many fortified posts, and I don't know why it's not showing it over here, but they ran in sort of a 90-degree angle into the forest. And those are areas that the Ukrainians were able to absorb attacks from up until the past 2 to 3 weeks. And the way in which the forest fell in such quick succession afterwards does indicate that it really did operate as a house of cards, and the Russians were able to exploit the lack of depth in terms of Ukraine's defensive forces, not in terms of territory, because, the forest is really, filled with depth, actually, but the Ukrainian reserves weren't, and as a result, they were able to take it over. So that's based off of the geolocation. And this means that the 53rd Brigade naturally did withdraw either south of the river or into Yampil. So Yampil will now be a focus for the Russian side, but so will crossing over the river and targeting the northern flank of Seversk. In Chandrikholova, we have an update. So the Russians have been able to close in on a lot of the outstretched Ukrainian pockets that were holding out in large tree lines and forested plantations. They've just been taken over by the Russian side, and now they're just closing in on what remains of Chandrikholova. So to begin with, they took over about 10.6 square kilometers, including several layers of forested plantations, cutting off Volitsia Huchenka, which is the road that leads into Liman itself. And that means that the Ukrainians have a very narrow corridor of escape, because there are still some within this 500-meter corridor that are based out of the eastern parts of the town and near some of the agricultural areas. So now they're being closed in on from the east, south, and the north, because we have this campaign by the Russian side amounting to 2.46 square kilometers. And this includes capturing certain parts of Sredny by the Russian side, and probably by the 20th Combined Arms Army. Actually, sorry, it's within the 20th Army. I believe you have the 144th Motor Rifle Division, and so the units from that division are the ones conducting this assault on this particular town. So FPV strikes were conducted onto those soldiers as they continued pushing deeper into the town, and that was on September 17th. And so at this point, the noose is really tightening, and the Ukrainians will be squeezed out, giving the Russians a base of operations to then move southwards along said paved road in the direction of Zaporizhzhia and then Lyman itself. So this is a very important route to keep an eye out for, because this does spell a lot of negative consequences for the Ukrainian defenders in Lyman itself. Now, let's turn off the unit map for a moment so we can get a clear view of what's going on in Kharkiv. The Russian side was able to capture 3.3 square kilometers, and this is just to the west of Ivanivka and to the northwest of Stepovo-Novoselivka. So recently, the Russians have been able to deepen their advances in this area due to the weakening of the front line, as the Ukrainians sent their reinforcements to the city of Kupyansk to directly absorb the Russian assault over there. As a result, now we have reporting from the Ukrainian side with deep state showing that the Russians have been able to overrun yet another line of tree lines, ditches, and they're getting very close actually to the outskirts of Petropavlivka, which is a very expansive village in terms of its extent from over this point over here. And then going vertically northwestwards, it's about 8 kilometers in its spans. So now the Russians are getting close to those first houses that can be used as organization points and can be used to isolate and cut off the outstretched Ukrainian pockets and open fields that are just near gray zones that haven't really been attended to by either side. They've not really been at the center of any sort of kinetic movement on the ground. In Kupyansk, the Ukrainians, they're talking about small squads of Russian forces spanning from 2 to 9. So that's actually a lot of variation, and that means that there are some larger groups as well. They're given tasks to storm individual houses. They're given the addresses to these buildings. Sometimes they're 5-story buildings, 9-story buildings. And so they're already engaging in those tasks, and I would imagine that's occurring near the northern part of Kupyansk, including this apartment complex area that you see under Ukrainian control. Now, the Ukrainians claim that they were able to flood and greatly damage the gas pipeline that was used before by the Russian side to cross from the eastern to the western side of the Oska River. But at this point, it's too little too late, because by now we have the 27th Motor Rifle Brigade. They already have bases on the western bank in large populated areas like Kindrashivka, Holubivka, Kalinove, and already infiltrating into the northern outskirts of Kupyansk. Moreover, the Russians are crossing over at this point using small boats or rafts or wood planks even. And given the fact that the river is not necessarily the most wide, like there are certain areas that are certainly wide, but not necessarily near Kupyansk, so it's pretty narrow. You could even swim it if you are willing to get wet. And so the logistics situation is beginning to improve over here as the Russians consolidate their gains. And so when it comes to Kupyansk, the Ukrainians did move in the 3rd Assault Brigade, and we're going to have to see now what effects that has on the course of the fighting and whether the Ukrainians could actually stabilize the line. But I'll just note that this is happening at the same time that the Russians are conducting additional DRG operations near Milove, where they were able to cross over the border into Ukraine proper within Kharkiv. And so that appears to, again, be a diversion in an attempt to redirect Ukrainian forces away from defending within the city of Kupyansk itself. And so that's largely a task for the 127th Heavy Mechanized Brigade. They're going to have to endure the Russian attacks from that direction. There are also rumors of Russian troop rotation currently going on near Oleksivka, with the 30th Motorized Rifle Regiment taking the place of the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade, and that the Ukrainians are trying to catch the Russians by surprise and assault their positions in Oleksivka. So again, keep an eye out for it, but nothing confirmed from that particular area. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.